right. So thank you everyone for attending today. My name is Kevin Navratil, and I am the Democracy Commitment Coordinator and a political science professor at Moraine Valley. And today, the program is continuing to examine the polarization, extremism, anger, and mistrust afflicting our country. We're over a year into the COVID-19 pandemic, which seems like forever and the worst thing ever. However, from a historical context, we've experienced far worse, and this isn't the first time that a pandemic has led to domestic extremism. So our focus today in our discussion is going to examine some of the historical examples of pandemics, social upheaval, or other major crises and how they have resulted in a backlash in extremism or rejection of authorities. So I'm very pleased to be joined by three of my friends and colleagues in my department. We have all three of our panelists are members of the history discipline at Moraine Valley. We have Merri Fefles-Dunkle, who, in addition to being a history professor, also teaches sociology and political science courses. And we have Jim McIntrye. And finally, we have Josh Fulton joining us today. And thank you to each of you. I've said this before, but you know, it means a lot that you continue to volunteer your time and expertise to help us understand some of the issues that we're facing and provide your expertise on these topics. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for organizing this.
I did add in the chat menu that there's an opportunity for those of you who are attending this live WebEx event to ask questions. We'll get to those as we can, so feel free to add any questions or comments that you may have via the chat function. So to start off with, maybe just the first question could be, you know, thinking about historical examples of pandemics or social upheaval, major crises that have resulted in extremism or rejection of authority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah. I think that would be my segue to talk about, you know, one of I think all three of us in the history departments, something that we all touch on in our classes, right? The Black Death. Whenever we teach Western Civ 1 or the bubonic plague, the first big outbreak that hits the Mediterranean basin between 1355 and 1345, sorry, and 1350. And you know, as we were just preparing for this yesterday, one of the reactions, and I think, you know, one of the underlying causes, though this is purely theory on my part, is the idea of why is this happening? Why is this happening to us? And so an easy go-to explanation in Western Europe was, you know, it's a plague sent by God. Mm-hmm. And so you get this reaction called the flagellants. These were people who would actually have parades around the village or town, whipping themselves on the bare back and I mean, seriously flogging themselves, drawing blood. And the idea behind this as a demonstration of their faith. So if we show that we are willing to undergo some of the, you know, agonies of Christ, that God will see that we are devout and therefore stop this horrible plague from afflicting us. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, the reality of the situation when it comes down to medical fact is you've got by now the pneumonic plague where it's airborne, and you've got people with open bleeding wounds. So that really doesn't reduce the mortality of the plague. In fact, quite the opposite. In the end, you know, but again, I think that's, you know, as I thought about, we talked yesterday a little bit about different peasant uprisings that occur both in France and England as well, but I think those are more convoluted in the sense that they're also due to, you have taxation going on and greater sort of exactions by the nobility due to the 100 Years' War. So I think it gets too convoluted to say there's a real close connection to the plague. Mm-hmm. So temporally, they're fairly close in time. at any rate, I think that gets us started, and has probably given my colleagues some ideas to make much more intelligent statements than I. So
no, that's great. That's great. Josh, you want to go first?
Sure. In thinking about sort of pandemics or epidemics that I've either sort of led directly to, forms of, moving back against or pushing back against authority, or forms of political violence or political sort of discord. I'm thinking a bit about the 18th century and smallpox in the latter part of the 18th century. In the mid 1770s through the early 1780s, occurring at sort of, apace with the American Revolution, and I'm thinking as well about sort of broader epidemics throughout kind of the transformational 19th century. Really thinking about, kind of cholera in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, as we're seeing sort of urbanization and that kind of unrest, as we see immigrant groups kind of coming in and all of that. And then in the second half of the 19th century, thinking about things like tuberculosis and its contributions to, sort of political and class unrest, and the rising anarchism and political extremism that we're going to see, sort of within that time. And certainly leading up though to 1918 and into 1919 as well, for the global influenza pandemic that wrecks the world, and leaves the world with a death toll that we're still kind of grappling with, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we're going to be saying the same thing about COVID, where we're not going to be sure how many 50 years from now, still estimating.
And it's a good question, right? Because you've got, folks who in the, I guess, less accepting of the realities of what COVID has been, sort of saying, well, if someone passes away due to this other thing, but they had COVID, it's the other thing that's the real cause of death. COVID's not the real, and so there's that semantic debate that folks get into as well. So there's that too. But I'm sorry if I cut you off. I didn't mean to do that.
No. I was bouncing off of what you were saying, because
cool.
I think it's going to be interesting to see later on, because I think we talked about that before, right? If you had cancer and you also have COVID, did COVID hasten that death that maybe you would have lasted longer? So I wonder how historians are going to be parsing that out in the future. If we're still going to be doing that, like we're still doing 100 years later with the influenza. But yeah, I think what led, now these guys were, I'm sure, baffled by my talk yesterday, because I was telling them that I was, bouncing back and forth between the Salem witch trials and AIDS. So there might seem like a bit of a disconnect there. One's going on in the 1690s and one's going on in the 1980s, but there actually are some connections. So forgive me if I kind of go back and forth. You guys kind of ground me back to earth if I'm not making any sense. But with the AIDS pandemic, I see a lot of connections between that and COVID. And one of it is, I think, right now we're still kind of in the immediacy of COVID. And if you guys remember, I think we all the four of us sort of grew up with the immediacy of AIDS, in the 80s, where we remember all those things as they were happening. And now AIDS is sort of like a permanent way of life. And I'm just curious, I think in 5 or 10 years, I'm wondering if COVID's going to be kind of the same way. We're going to have to be having a booster shot every few years because of these mutations that might continue to occur. But I was just thinking also of some of the variables that are similar. And tell me if you guys I wrote some of them down, but tell me if you can think of some other ones I'm not thinking of. But just even of media information, right? The information changing all the time about what we knew about it at the time. Newsweek had an article in 1988 saying that you could get HIV/AIDS from kissing and from toilet seats. And I kind of vaguely remember that, but I was also in grade school. But I just remember the overall fear. And I think that's obviously something that's universal, whether we're talking about Jim's flagellants or, we're talking about, the tuberculosis or the influenza. People are freaking out because they don't know what to do with themselves. They don't know how this is going to affect themselves or their kids. I remember parents not letting their kids go to the playground and play in the playground. Funeral homes not taking people who had AIDS. not accepting them. And now with COVID, my cousin is an ICU nurse and was out in California working, and was just talking about the multitude of trucks that were outside the hospital because the funeral homes couldn't keep up with all the bodies, but all the the extra. But at least they're accepting the bodies. They're not just the way that we're, with AIDS had that stigma because of course homosexuals were being stigmatized. They were scapegoated. It was their fault, right? Whereas I think with Jim's it was more like we're bad. God's punishing us because we're bad. But in this case, it was no, these guys are bad because God's punishing them for their deadly sin of being for being homosexual. And then something else I wrote down too. Yeah, the disinformation, because that's kind of similar too. The CDC trying to keep up with things. And just like how the way that the virus, I think, was so virulent and how it wreaked havoc on the body so quickly. Because I think for all of us, you'd know people that all of a sudden seemed like they were fine, and then in 2 seconds later with COVID were on their deathbed. And with AIDS, I mean, it seemed like it wreaked havoc so quickly on people that were seemingly okay, and then unfortunately were in the early years it seemed to be a death sentence. And now it's something that people are living with, which is the same thing with COVID. So I don't know if anything else you guys can think of that you see similarities with. Well, Kevin, if you want to jump in.
What I thought, Merri, when you were mentioning like the article you alluded to about transmission of AIDS from USA Today, I think you said, or
Newsweek.
Or Newsweek, sorry. But I think at least my recollections, because I was in grammar school as well, and it just seemed like the reactions of the adults around me were more like, well, they're learning more about this. Mm-hmm. Whereas today, it's branded fake news. Whenever information changes, there seems to be like a deeper paranoia about this.
Absolutely.
And a paranoia about science and scientists in general. And I think that's something that's unfortunately unique to this moment. It's like, well, I'm sorry, but scientific advances, the more people unravel what's going on with anything, right?
It feeds into why we're here, though.
It's going to change.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but going back to the plague, it's not spread by foul vapors, right? COVID is not spread by foul vapors, folks. Yeah. So we're going to have to look at a germ theory here.
Yeah.
Wait, miasmas aren't a thing? Oh no.
To your point, Merri, I'm wondering about if any of you could kind of speak to this based on your previous point, Merri, kind of a backlash of blaming, the perceived originators of whether it was the AIDS pandemic, COVID pandemic, the violence against communities who have been blamed.
Asian Americans.
Right. Yeah. So I was thinking in particular, the hundreds of people who have been attacked in last year, Asian Americans in the United States, but then also, for you from a historical standpoint, parallels with, with AIDS and.
Definitely. Well, and for for the religious right, the moral majority and the 700 Club, this is a group that we're just sort of having their, and I'm sure they would love this statement, kind of their coming out party, right? In the late 70s, they were becoming a political force and amassing huge amounts of money at the same time that this pandemic began. And homosexuals, because this began as it was referred to as the gay cancer in the beginning, because it did seem at the beginning like it was largely just affecting homosexuals because it was transmitted through sex. That seemed to be the only way that we knew, at least at the time. They made a good scapegoat, right? And they made the far right the religious right made huge amounts of money by scapegoating these men, by sending out pamphlets to their and they were also, I have to say, brilliant at fundraising. In days before they had databases that were on computers, they had these written databases, and so they used them and through obviously the TV as well, like the 700 Club. But to be able to amass this amount of money and create this political empire, but a lot of it was based on, in the 80s, scapegoating people and gay men made a good target because also they were still relatively young in terms of amassing their own political movement, right? Stonewall just happened in '69. They were just kind of getting themselves organized with different like ad hoc organizations. But then you start to see like as the pandemic goes on, as we get into like the late '80s and the '90s, where you start to see some real organization going on, like ACT UP, that was Larry Kramer's organization. I don't know if you guys remember this. I read something that I forgot. I don't remember seeing this. When the Gulf War started, like in January of '91, do you guys remember that a group of ACT UP activists got on CBS and were shouting over Dan Rather? I don't know how they even got into the studio, but we're saying that AIDS is our enemy, not Arabs. Kill AIDS and not Arabs. I don't even remember that happening. They were using tactics like that, but then became much more mainstream. As I think as AIDS too became much more mainstream too, and the cause was taken up by people like by so-called Hollywood elite too, which I was going to talk about that a little bit more when I talked about the government response. But yeah, absolutely. And then they became more organized as an organization and were able to fight back a bit better. But it's like David versus Goliath to fight back like at that kind of that constant attack. I read an article that I should share with you guys that was so interesting, and it was about these Southern women. It was in the Journal of Southern American History that formed a pack called MAGIC, Mothers Against Jesse in Congress, about Jesse Helms. And they were mothers who had lost their sons to AIDS, conservative women who had lost their sons to AIDS, and how Jesse Helms was like a one-man wrecking ball. He's the one that was like one of the 4 senators who voted against the CARES Act that was passed by Congress, right? He was constantly voting against refunding it every single year. And one of the mothers who knew him quite well sent him a letter and said, can you please just, this was my son. I loved him. And basically he wrote her back and said, well, he shouldn't, I really feel bad for you, but he shouldn't have engaged in that lifestyle. And ironically, she ended up in a nursing facility with him when he was dying of dementia years later, and saw him. Yeah. And saw him. And she's like, I realized that he was just a man, but he'd been this political wrecking ball. But, it was just rather cruel at the time. So I'll send it to you guys though, because it was a really interesting article.
I was thinking about, as you were speaking, Merri, about, sort of Hollywood and sort of getting involved in things, because, I often think back to try to speak from my own experiences and my, usually the last few weeks, if we're all teaching an American history survey too, it's the history of everything since we've been alive kind of a thing, half the time. And, I remember very little. Maybe it's because I was sheltered or whatever. I remember very little of the genuinely first thing that I recall was Magic Johnson. Of that was really sort of the absolute sort of first thing, and the fear that surrounded that whole conversation and that whole discussion. And it makes me think a little bit about other pandemics and about that idea of what do we fear, why do we fear it, and that kind of thing. Because I think it was in his book on the influenza pandemic, Alfred Crosby makes the case of we tend to fear this sort of exotic other, this sort of mystically exotic other. We tend to fear, if you're a little kid, right, you fear a big scary monster. You don't fear what's close to you, right? You don't fear the little stuff. And his point is that basically that's the same thing for adults, of that we tend not to fear something that can be transmitted when we're just sitting down in a restaurant and sort of engaging in conversation and having some appetizers. We don't fear that. We fear this big other thing, which is kind of intriguing. But to Kevin's point, I think about sort of discrimination and about political violence and things. I'm thinking about it was making me think about Chinatown in San Francisco and the treatment of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and Chinese Americans there in the early 1900s, when you had these outbreaks, and the idea is that the community was blamed. But then again, this is also a time period in which eugenics is normalized, race science is considered the most civil way a nation can act. So, in many ways, it was sort of the name of the game, for those, those time periods. I mean, it's part of the reason why, when the first polio outbreaks started happening in 1916 in New York City, elites were shocked that this was affecting white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were of wealth, of how is it possible that this can happen? Because these kinds of things only happen to immigrants. They only happen to non-white
Dirty
individuals.
people.
Right. They only happen to Teutonic stock, individuals. And this is, certainly something that was present as well with tuberculosis and those kind of things. But, that fear, I think, is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I did have one question that came up in the chat so far that I wanted to try to weave into this. So over the summer, the murder of George Floyd and the backlash, people taking to the streets, protesting, and I think the comment in the chat was about kind of the looting that was going on too. And I think the point being is just like people in a pandemic are angry. Maybe we're, at least last summer by that point, we're months into this pandemic. So do you think that too, just in a pandemic where people are scared, it leads, sometimes things come out sideways where there's maybe a bigger backlash to what's going on in part because of a pandemic? That's what I'm trying to interpret the question, but I think that's what the intent was. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of too soon to tell with that one. I don't know what you guys think, but because I feel like the issue of George Floyd was just sort of like, this was like sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. This had happened so many times. But I mean, think about with Rodney King, things that happened multiple times too. What made that different in 1992? I mean, I was on camera, don't get me wrong, but was it necessarily the pandemic that made this happen? I think it was the pandemic that maybe gave people time to see what was happening more. I think for white people, maybe to get more politically active and get involved. But I don't know if necessarily the looting part of it. I don't know, maybe because it is summertime, so people are out and about more. People wanted to get out, so maybe that did kind of agitate people more. But I don't know if the outcome would have been if it would have been different. And I could be totally off on this, but would there have been less protest had there not been a pandemic? If I'm saying if it wasn't George Floyd, it might have been something else. I don't know. I could be totally off on that. What do you guys think?
I'd probably agree with you, Merri. I'm thinking about 1968 and kind of because there is on one side you have genuine political protests, and if we study the history of protest movements, right, the idea is that largely these are going to be nonviolent, largely these are going to be very peaceful actions, be it for racial justice or other social causes or really anything, but that I forget the percentages off the top of my head, but that often you're going to get some folks who, as a side part of it, because of the political climate of the era, also have other objectives sort of in mind. And that's sort of where when thinking about things like the looting and sort of other stuff like that, it's an event has created a climate whereby that can occur. It's not connected though. It's not it's not fully linked there because they're doing that. So yeah, no, I wonder, and I think I agree with you that sort of time will tell on it. But certainly, if anything, right, the pandemic sort of created a climate whereby more opportunities, I guess, existed or something like that.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you as well, and I would think that I would just add that I think due to everyone being on lockdown through the spring and early summer, and then with a 24-hour news cycle, you are repeatedly viewing. If you choose to do that, you're going to be repeatedly seeing, and I think that's something new. I think that's something that the students we're training now are really going to dig into. you know, if they go into the historical profession, because how has this new media cycle altered the perception and altered, because again, you know, we're cooped up, and I think people are, I don't know if people are so much maybe angry at COVID in a way, but also just generally frustrated with the situation around them that they really have no control over. And then things start to loosen up, and then there's this opportunity to join in a mass movement. And so, as you said, Josh, you know, it said you get a certain set of conditions that maybe heighten, you know, something that would have been pre-existing already. I think we would have seen protests.
Yeah.
I don't know that maybe those protests would have reached the levels that they did. And also the as we talked about previously, I think on the staff development day, Merri, you brought up the idea of all the sort of fake reportage that was going on.
On that day, you mean when that was?
Yeah. So I think again, that's a new. Well, no, you've always had the rumor mill, right? But now,
Right.
I think it's strange because we all have devices that can, and we've talked about this before too, right? Where we are all sort of reporters, right, or can be.
Yes.
But we still have, right, like that, you know, you could call it like the Dan Rather syndrome, where if you see it on TV, it must be vetted. Well, no, that's no longer the case, right? If you see an image on a screen, that could have been created by anybody.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
But it's attributed with a legitimacy that perhaps it is undeserving of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I did also point out in the chat that you know, about 2 months ago, I think it was, Merri, where you, Matthew Harland, criminal justice professor, and Dr. John Roman had discussed like the significant rise of the murder rate in the last year in the United States, and also some of just the, you know, frayed relationship between communities and police, and rising kind of domestic violence. So I don't want to spend too much more time on that since we did have a separate event, but I thought perhaps it'll come back up again, and that's fine through questions. But just to kind of shift gears a little bit, kind of thinking about the role of the state in times of disorder, you know, what government does, and or perhaps, you know, going back to Jim's first example, the bubonic plague, you know, if there wasn't a strong state presence. I just wanted to kind of frame the next question and your responses, thinking about what government has or hasn't done, and the backlash with that through various pandemics or crises.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. Okay.
Go for it, Josh.
You know, sure. So, you know, the idea of the role of the state makes me think a little bit about a couple of things. The first being, you know, in the 19th century, often you have a federal government that, at least especially in the first half of the 19th century, doesn't really see direct engagement with the public in that way as its responsibility in any way, shape, or form. You know, that's not the job of the federal government to provide any kind of aid or structure sort of in that way. But if we're thinking about sort of the late 19th century and really the first half of the 20th century, federal government very much so sees its role as kind of articulating what the state is supposed to be, and then constructing programs to provide aid along those lines. And, you know, again, in the second half of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, this is an era in which racial science predominates, the idea of whiteness is best, right? Sort of that construct. And this is also gendered and it's sexualized and all of that. And so what you'll then see is the state constructing public health institutions, you know, kind of along those specific lines. I mean, the creation of the United States Public Health Service, right, sort of within that particular period, right, was directly informed by these scientific views by the sort of rising tide of nativism that existed in the country in the first years of the 20th century, which culminates, right, in the construction of an immigration system in 1924 that largely stops most immigration coming into the United States. Right. This is why, when folks are at Ellis Island or the often forgotten in the broader public Angel Island, this is why certain immigrants are, or all immigrants are checked for supposedly certain diseases, because the public is very concerned about that these immigrants would be bringing in disease, right? Sort of all of that. But this throughout all of it, right? The state is fairly commonly clear, especially by the time you get to the era of World War I, in constructing sort of what the state means to them and how the rest of America should fall in line. This is abundantly clear, certainly in things like the First World War and, sort of that idea of what are we fighting for, right? That kind of construct.
Right. Do you want me to go, Jim, or do you?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this was like I was telling inarticulately, saying to the guys yesterday that this was kind of an interesting question for the AIDS pandemic, because, and I'm talking only now about the federal government response, not state government, because I don't know enough about that to comment on. But it's really interesting because, first of all, in the 80s, so you still have three, sort of functioning branches of government, right? The legislative branch is still functioning, unlike now where it's like barely functioning. So while the AIDS response under Reagan is to pretty much say nothing, because Reagan, Reagan was buoyed into, I probably should mention this for the sake of the audience, Reagan was buoyed into the Oval Office on the backs of evangelical Christians. This is a guy who was a New Deal Democrat, right, who got huge amounts of support from the religious right, and they expected certain things from him. And so when the AIDS crisis comes out, he doesn't even use the word AIDS in his speech until about 1987. And yet there are things that are happening around him that are, obviously troublesome. One of them is that one of his close friends, because Ronald Reagan, again, for those who don't know, was an actor. Not the greatest actor, I would say, but just a personal opinion, I'm just saying. But he was an actor in Hollywood, president of the Screen Actors Guild at one time. And one of his good friends, though, was Rock Hudson. And Rock Hudson was a very famous Hollywood leading man who tragically was stricken with AIDS and died in '88, I believe it was, of AIDS. And that struck obviously very close to home for President Reagan, because that was a good friend of his. And so I think that kind of started motivating him to at least be a little bit more public about it. But on the other hand, though, Congress was getting now lobbied nonstop from these organizations like these ACT UP, and even, and I got to give her credit, and I'm not saying that she's like the only one, I'm just saying her as an example, but like someone like an Elizabeth Taylor from Hollywood, because Elizabeth Taylor was like, this very strong woman to be reckoned with, who shows up to Congress, and I don't know if you guys remember this. I kind of forgot about this until I had this image in my mind. I woke up like in the middle of the night, don't ask me why. Think of remembering her with her very large shoulder pads, showing up to Congress with her. She had to have her white diamonds, I'm sure, perfume on that she sold, and with some major real diamonds on too, to lobby to Congress about AIDS funding. And they were like salivating, because here's Elizabeth Taylor, this beautiful Hollywood actress that none of them had ever seen up close. And here she was there to lobby on behalf of someone like Rock Hudson and others, and Ryan White, who's a young hemophiliac boy who'd been stricken with AIDS. So putting that kind of star power behind it started to make the state kind of sit up and say, okay, we need to do something about this. And not just them, I want to make it clear, it's obviously others as well, but all of that power combined. But what was interesting, though, that I came across is that, Reagan had appointed C. Everett Koop as his Surgeon General. This made me think of the COVID pandemic now. And C. Everett Koop was a very, very ardent anti-abortion campaigner. And I think the religious right thought that he would be like kind of their guy in that role. And he was. But when it came to the AIDS pandemic, he basically was like, no, we have to give funding to schools to teach basically about sexually transmitted diseases and how this disease is being spread. And so they have to have this education. And the right was really angry about that, because they said, you're basically encouraging immorality, and you're encouraging homosexual lifestyles and blah, blah, blah. And he said, no, this is basically, this is science. And this is like, kind of like my job, you know, I took that Hippocratic oath kind of thing. And so he stood up for it. So it's kind of interesting how you see this, you know, things happening at the same time where they're saying kind of one thing, but doing another at the same time. So I found that to be really interesting. But by the 90s, of course, I think the approach, it's been mainstream, right? You mentioned Magic Johnson. I think the government approach to AIDS was totally mainstream by then because of so many people who had it. So chime in if you think of anything else I'm not thinking of too.
I was actually going to dovetail with what you said, Merri, because I remember that. I remember that on CNN. So I'm really showing I'm old. But beyond that, that I think when you mentioned Rock Hudson's death, I think that was really the beginning of like sort of Hollywood activism on a social medical issue. Mm-hmm. You had a little bit for, you know, of course, and of course, my mind goes to probably the worst example, Jane Fonda and Vietnam. Yeah. And I think honestly, in ways that may have made a lot of the Hollywood elites or A-listers or whatever descriptor we want to use, shy away from getting involved because of the backlash on her. But then with Rock Hudson, and here was sort of this example, right, of, as you said, right, very strong male leading man, sort of, you know, the male figure in a number of movies.
Handsome guy,
also, right, and he was also on like a nighttime soap just before until he got too sick to act, basically. Yeah. So here was someone who was very much in the limelight, very much a public figure, and you know was recognized and respected in Hollywood at the time. And so it kind of showed that, look, this isn't just a small segment of the population, and you know, and encourage that activism. I think was part of it. There was something else that, you know, that popped in akin to your Salem connection yesterday, when Josh, you were describing sort of limits on immigration and this concern about, you know, what are immigrants bringing into the country. My mind went to Natalie Zeman Davis and the rights of violence and the whole construct dating from early modern Europe of the community as the body politic, and those others as being infectious to the body politic. And I think, you know, what we might be seeing is just a continuation of that trope over time, over the longue durée, if I can go a little, you know, Ferdinand Braudel on everyone. But you know, I think, you know, the other issue that brings up is that it becomes something ingrained in our consciousness, right? Like, we don't even think about this notion of others and fear. It's just there. So then what do you do about it?
Right.
So we can, just to back up perhaps a moment, I noticed that Jan pointed out that Rock Hudson died in October of 1985. And
85, okay.
If I'm not mistaken, I want to say Reagan's first public comments on AIDS was like, 1985.
I thought it was 87. Maybe I'm wrong though. I could be wrong.
Well, but my point being, without getting too much into the Trump administration's response to COVID-19, but just kind of the downplaying and the public rhetoric of, you know, it's only one case and, you know, it's got to go away and that kind of thing. For somebody like me who doesn't have that historical knowledge like the three of you, has that happened, you know, in previous pandemics of kind of the downplaying of presidents and to those kind of examples that we just mentioned?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. You know, if not pandemics, certainly within other you know, major sort of dramatic events, right? So part of it is, you know, the idea of otherizing it, sort of say, well, it's not really a big problem. It's really only an immigrant problem. You know, sort of that kind of thing. So you're looking at last decades of the first decade or so of the 20th century. So there's that. But, you know, when you're talking about the idea of presidents downplaying, the first thing that came to my mind was Herbert Hoover in the Great Depression. Basically, you get to about mid 1930 into 31, and Hoover was very, very prominently someone who didn't really say much, but it became very common that he needed to address this in some way. But he basically started addressing it by saying, wasn't this depression horrible? And trying to sort of say, now it's over. It's over. It's almost sort of like the think method of the Music Man, of sort of that kind of thing. So yes, there is a precedent for some, administrations with major events, like catastrophically major events that hit the country, to basically, misdirect or to attempt to shift focus in order to be able to address other things. Now, of course, in the case of somebody like Hoover, by the time you get to 1932 and the bonus march and the tear gas in DC against veterans, you can't really ignore that. But at least at the beginning, that was kind of the idea. And then part of it was to shift blame, right? It's Americans don't have this. It's these immigrants who have this. And part of that nativism and part of that Americanization effort that runs even through World War I was the belief that those first generation immigrants couldn't really become Americans, that naturalization isn't really possible. And so really placing the blame on them and saying that needed to shift or to be changed.
My mind, Kevin, went to when you said that, not necessarily to presidents, but to Philadelphia. Was it 1918, I believe, when they were having a sort of a welcome home party for soldiers returning from World War I, and Philadelphia officials were begging the city of Philadelphia, please don't have this parade.
Oh, the Liberty Loan Drive, the Liberty Loan Drive, yeah.
Please don't have this parade because you're gonna just spread the pandemic, spread the influenza even worse. And they went ahead and had it anyway, and thousands of people died as a result of it. So it wasn't necessarily the actions of the president downplaying it, but it was more like, no, we're going to have this parade regardless. But countries, during the Spanish influenza, downplayed it, right? The only one who didn't was Spain, and Spain got the benefit of getting it named the Spanish influenza and got totally screwed as a result of it. But we were the government in general was downplaying it, right? We had bigger goals at that point. So I wouldn't necessarily say just a particular president in terms of that one, but that's where my mind went.
And getting back to that question too, I think what you mentioned with Reagan is also interesting because think about it, it's 85, 86. It's his second term. He won in 84 with a landslide, but he's also in his second term. So politically, he can kind of do what he wants at that point. And at that point, if the pressure is so great, the phone's ringing with his connections from his Hollywood days saying, look, you've got, and again, that's not documented, but I strongly suspect that there were a lot of people, a lot of his backers of long standing, shall we say, kind of calling him to account by that. And again, he doesn't have to worry about re-election.
Right. And I think that was genuine because he was really good friends with him. So, the idea that, and I think maybe and I'm sorry for being off on the dates, but I think my mind is like, but I think that was not a disingenuous response. I think he did want to speak out about it earlier, but that fear of, again, that they call him the Teflon president for a reason, right? He managed to find this way to always get things to not stick to him. So he would find ways to do things when he could, right? And then always like kind of back away when he needed to protect himself. So you're absolutely right. By that time, he also had other fish to fry too with the Iran-Contra scandal and other things that were brewing in his presidency.
Jan Kapisky pointed out that Reagan's first comments were September 17th, 1985. And Rock Hudson dies about 2 weeks later in October. Okay. So coincidence, who knows? Can't answer that. But I wanted to switch gears a little bit, just based on some of the comments that, in particular, Josh had mentioned. So this isn't necessarily pandemic, but in terms of like major social upheaval, time periods with rapid immigration, because Josh has mentioned this, I'm thinking Chinese Exclusion Act. You know, I know that you, in our previous discussion, we were talking about the post-1920s or early 1920s and, reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan, replacement theory and so forth. So I wondered if you could, the three of you or whoever feels most comfortable talking about it, just that kind of response to social upheaval and rapid change.
If we're thinking about that period, especially so late 19th, sort of early 20th century, to use your phrase, Kevin, of rapid change, right? Yeah, it's incredibly rapid, right? It shocked Americans how quickly things were changing to go from this, incredibly rural landscape to these new major cities with all of these electric lights, with these big, huge factories, and all. This is an environment that shocked folks, and so to add on to that forms of disease outbreak. And also a real feeling that your sense of agency is going away, kind of in the everyday. Folks act out and they look for things to blame and they look for people to blame. And that informs some of their activism sort of within the context of that period. And so, when the state is clearly making their focus being, support of the Andrew Carnegies of the world and the Rockefellers of the world and sort of that kind of thing, it becomes very hard for those individuals to be able to feel that they have a voice. And so they, look to other means, which we deem to be radical, which we deem to be, sort of unacceptable. So yeah, on one side you end up with millions of immigrants that are coming in, and so you have these opposition groups that rise up that are actively supportive of nativism, stating that these individuals cannot become American. And then on the other side, you have these first and second generation immigrants in these urban environments, because many of these immigrants who are coming in, regardless of where they're coming, are going to end up in major cities. Very few of them are going to end up out on the farm. I mean, that was a much earlier in the 19th century idea, who feel that the tenement life is horrible, but what else can they do? What other choice do they have? Where else can they go? And, for some of them, there's no representation for them. What kind of advancement can they have? And so, when we tend to think of individuals that, we consider to be anarchists, now, we think of these very horrible, awful things, and many of them in the 1870s and 80s. We're looking for things like maybe a decent wage, a little bit of time off of work, of sort of that, that's anarchistic in an era in which unions are illegal. And so, you sort of end up with that kind of interlocking kind of to that as well. But yeah, those would be my first comments or thoughts. So,
Jim, do you mind if do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
I was going to bring up kind of, and this actually is because this happens throughout American history, right? Like as immigrants kind of coming, it sounds like the days of our lives as the sands of time go through. But it's like these waves that crash on the ocean, right? As they come in. So in the 1840s, you have these Irish and German immigrants that are coming in these huge numbers. So you start to see the formation of these anti-immigrant societies that pop up all over the place. That ends up leading to the formation of a political party known as the American Party that becomes known as the Know Nothing Party, because, as we were joking about before, they'd ask you, well, what? Tell me about this society. Well, I know nothing. I don't know anything about it. And it became known as the Know Nothing Party. But literally, the platform of the American Party was a nativist anti-immigrant party, right? These Irish were dirty. They were lazy. They drank. They were Catholic. That's the worst sin of all, right? The Germans, we talked about, they drank on Sundays, right? They were also, they did work really hard, so we had to give them that, right? Even though we didn't like that, but they did work really, really hard. So they weren't lazy like the Irish, but still they're overtaking, they're taking our jobs. I mean, this is a sentiment that you hear again and again throughout American history. It's nothing new, whether it's the Italians, whether it's Greeks, whether it's Russian Jews. But literally an entire political party is formed. And it's not a coincidence that this is happening also in the backdrop of the political unrest that's going on in the country in the 1850s, with secession kind of looming in the background, right? And the American Party kind of gets some traction, wins some state governments, and sends some people to Congress, but kind of falls because the Republican Party then ascends at the same time, and they kind of fall out of grace. But I mean, yeah, literally an entire political party comes out of just this nativist impulse. And one can see parallels of that today, right? When Donald Trump is talking about creating a separate political party, is that different from what it's based on? I mean, I'm sure obviously superficially there are going to be some differences, but there are a whole lot of similarities, I would argue.
I just would quickly add to that, for us who, I'm thinking of Merri and I, who had panels in the 2016 nomination election and then the general election, to where I know that, at least I can speak for myself, really underestimated Donald Trump's campaign.
Totally.
But the way that immigration, building a wall, and having really, I guess, the most conservative or strong views against immigration was able to outflank his 16. There was a lot of really strong candidates on the Republican side who were, former governors, current governors, former senators. But, that everything you just described kind of speaks to how that same issue played a role not only in 2016, but then you're kind of thinking about going forward, about maybe through global migration, how you see people not only in Central America due to hurricanes and domestic violence, gangs and cartels, but in parts of the Middle East and Northern Africa too, just high temperatures and broken governments, and so how that might lead to parties being divisions in Western countries like the United States being divided on immigration so much.
For sure. They're an easy scapegoat. Oh, I'm sorry, Josh. I was just going to say, as you said, they're an easy scapegoat because, like you said, they lack agency, right? But so, I mean, whether we're talking about women in Salem who are independent and they're easy scapegoats, gay men, in the 80s, like the common denominators that these are people who all like agency. Sorry, Josh, go ahead. That's all.
No, it's okay. I was just thinking about what both of you were saying and saying that it's good for our audience to remember that, the border as it exists today, especially in the South, was constructed. The border was constructed over time. That most of the southwestern United States, it was Mexico. I think a part of the modern discussion often, sort of ignores sort of that reality. And the reality for many who identify as Latinx in the first half of the 20th century, the debate in terms of, in an era of whiteness and sort of all that debating over whether or not that individual would identify then as being white and sort of how that process would work. And there's that sort of aspect to it. But even when you have the understanding of this very, very harsh immigration restriction in 1924, of you still had an openness at both sides in the North and the South of, not wanting to restrict border flow from Canada or from Mexico, even sort of at that time now, then again, you still have other forms of virulent nativism that are existing in the country after the shutdown in 24 of, after the Philippines are sort of taken as a territory by the United States in the 20s, you still have this violent opposition to the presence of Filipinos, and part of the support for Filipino independence was predicated on the idea that you could kick Filipinos out of America, of that part of it. But yeah, I think it's, that border aspect of it is interesting. So.
Yeah.
One other, there's been some questions in the chat, and we're down to 20 minutes, and now is a great time for any of you participants. Thank you for attending, but please feel free to use the chat function. There's a way for you to ask all panelists, or you can just ask me as the moderator, but we hope to get to as many questions as we can. And one question, and I'm just kind of taking the idea of this question and reframing it a little bit, but it really, the question was getting at, if there's not domestic unity and there's so many frictions, whether it's political parties and different groups internally, the weakness that provides in your ability to confront big issues like a pandemic. And I'll turn it over to you to have your own responses, but perhaps like a twist of, is this new for the United States to be so domestically divided and not being able to coherently work together to agree upon solutions to big problems? Or do you find that, previous examples in history where this has happened too?
Jim, do you want to go? You have a chance to.
You could take that back to the founding, right? I mean, we grow up with this wonderful myth, right, that everyone wanted Britain out, but we forget that there's, and then at some point we learned that there are these really bad people called loyalists, right, who think that for a variety of reasons staying part of the British Empire is a good thing. But even in that mix, we don't really talk much about the neutrals who, for a variety of reasons, disinterest, religion, really took no stand, and oftentimes were persecuted and brutalized because they took no stand, right? Because they were just in the middle. Because we all know those Quakers are vicious seditionists and spies, and so I think, like, the serious point being, I think you could make a case, right, that more often in the history of the United States we have been politically divided. It's just you might find a consensus on a issue, but I think finding a consensus on any set of issues, you would be hard pressed to determine a point in our national history when that was the case.
Yes, I mean, go ahead, Josh. Go ahead.
No. I was just nodding in agreement. Yeah.
I was just thinking of Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner getting caned on the floor of Congress, right? Was that, and of course, since I'm doing poorly on dates today, was that 56? What year was that? I don't want to say 1856. I don't want to be wrong on 57. Thank you. See, I'm betting 1,000 for my dates. But I mean, we literally had actual, and Kevin and I talked about this one before, actual political violence because of Sumner's abolitionist views, and Preston Brooks was this congressman who basically beat him up with his cane on the congressional floor. And what happened? He gets expelled from Congress, runs again, goes back in, and then gets all these canes sent to him in the mail from his constituents saying, let's replace the cane that you lost when you beat the crap out of this senator on the floor of Senate. So, I mean, there have been times, obviously, that we have had some major disagreement culminating in a civil war. That's kind of a pretty big one. And I'm not saying it to be flippant. I'm saying just I mean, it's seriously true. And of course, I'd argue that probably even coming out of it, those years following the Civil War into Reconstruction were extremely tumultuous. And there's a reason why they call it the Second Civil War, because of just how shaky things were. So, I mean, in terms of political divide, yeah, we've been through some really bad times. My only concern is now, and Kevin, you might know better than this than I would. The Congress functioning so poorly though right now. I'm trying to remember a time when Congress has been so dysfunctional, and I'm trying to remember a time where it's been this bad, and I can't remember. I mean, because at least where nothing is really. I mean, we've had a couple, right? Bills got passed with COVID, right? There was some legislation that was passed with COVID. So it wasn't like nothing was done. But it seems like we can't get our act together with anything. So what we keep having is this cycle now today of executive action being taken, and then that immediately being undone by the next president coming in, and the legislative branch of government getting increasingly diminished while the executive branch is getting, and the judicial branch taking on greater importance. And that to me is really scary. So that is an example where I kind of go back and forth, where I do kind of worry about it right now. It is pretty bad.
Right. There's a couple of different ways that you can assess that. And as you mentioned, looking at major legislation, kind of cornerstone legislation of an administration, to see how many votes were obtained by the party that doesn't control the presidency. And as you mentioned, with certain recent acts with COVID relief has been different, but for the most part, you going back at least to the Obama administration, there just really isn't any examples of, I'm thinking of Trump's major tax cut where no Democrats supported it. I'm thinking of the Affordable Care Act and the Stimulus Act. One of those received one Republican vote, I think, in the House, but we're just generally opposed. So the other way of looking at it is to think of there's ways of assessing the ideological spectrum within the House and Senate, and looking at the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. And you can see visually on charts based on their voting records of how that has changed in the last 3 decades in particular. And of course, I was just talking about the least ideological within each party, but most of the members of Congress have moved to the extremes. So you can just see this huge gulf in between them, where many Americans might be more in the middle, and of course, for various reasons, our representatives don't really represent that. So you're right, as far as it is fairly new and unprecedented to have this level of polarization within the House and Senate, and then to have the party that's out of power of the presidency to essentially not be on board with anything. Because I'm thinking of sometime, the first Gulf War, or the vote in the vote for the war. Many Democrats supported that. Even the 2003 Iraq War, many Democrats supported that. So it is fairly new for students who may be watching this to have been, basically born in a time period with this level of polarization.
Right. I mean, you go back to the 80s even, right? I mean, there was still the sense of, we need to kind of, well, we can argue in front of the cameras, but let's do some log rolling, let's make some deals, and we'll get some stuff done. And that just seems to be, we're just kind of in our camps, and we cannot even sit together. Because if we sit together, that's indicating, that's you're betting for the other team. That's bad.
I mean, and we've talked about this before, right? Like the famous news, audio bite of Reagan and Tip O'Neill on St. Patrick's Day drinking together at the bar, and after Tip O'Neill had just argued vehemently that week against one of Reagan's programs on the House floor, but it was St. Patrick's Day, and so they're both going out to tip a glass together. Yeah. And I think that whole idea of sort of there's the business of politics during the week, but that doesn't mean we can't find, and I think that's something we desperately need, is to find some common grounds to make those deals happen, to make things get accomplished.
They'd go golfing together. They would be, baptize big godparents to one another's kids. There was and I still think that does exist to a degree. I just think that a lot of it has been since the 90s in particular. And it's interesting, John Boehner's book just came out today, former Speaker of the House, and he kind of alludes to that quite a bit. But I mean, he also wasn't saying too much at the time when it was happening under his wife too. So
I hate to sidetrack this too much, but I think that's an interesting conversation. But many of their kids, I'm thinking of the 70s, 80s in particular, even parts of the 90s, when you went to Congress, you primarily lived in DC, and your kids would go to school together, and there would be dinners And I think we all understand, when people ask me about polarization, it's like we need to work together, not just like physically work together, but we need to hang out together. We need to have our kids play together and all those types of things. And that doesn't mean that we diminish the differences that we have on political issues, but to your point, that's all different. And of course, social media and the way that you can kind of hijack media to, I guess, get attention by having a very extreme view is fairly new in our lifetimes too. I shared it via chat just so I don't know if you noticed it, panelists, but just kind of taking this idea of division, and there's been, even thinking of COVID-19, whether it's vaccines or masks or social distancing or how much we should close the economy during a pandemic. Clearly, there's been a lot of division, and this comes up quite a bit. This idea of, are we headed to a second civil war, or just like where states really kind of go their own ways completely on policies? And you talked about, the Civil War already. So like, are we worrying too much about the trajectory of this, of where we're at, or not enough? Do you see this as kind of getting worse than we've been in the past? Like, how do you view that?
Both. I mean, I think that I think that we're headed clearly for a civil war, an actual shooting war? I don't know, but this is concerning to me. The level of inability to build community, the level of inability to build some kind of collaborative work is very, 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 very concerning. Be it media, be it political, be it basic agreements on factual reality. I was chatting with my wife before we began this, and she was talking a bit about extremism, and I was thinking a bit about extremism, and she was, we were saying that we tend to think of this as a separate, otherized issue, much like we've been talking about before, when in reality, especially if we think to things like January 6th, that's not a separate, otherized reality. That's your local real estate agent. That's, Fred down the road. Mm-hmm. And we've got to figure out, how did Fred get there? And what can we do about that? And the fact that he's got there, right? The fact that QAnon has become so widely, profligate. Was it the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers and all these other sort of, that kind of thing of, of these individuals who do this, they view it as legitimate, and they view themselves as legitimate. And it's not that that's never happened before, but it's concerning how effective and how large it's growing.
Mm-hmm. I cannot see a scenario, but of course now I was wrong about 2016, right, Kevin? We always joke about that. But I cannot see a scenario in which states can go to war with other states, because it wouldn't benefit them. So for a state to secede from the union, they would lose so many benefits, right? So unless you're a state that's like that is giving more than it's receiving. But that being said, we're also interconnected. So a state isn't just like blue or red. A lot of them are they are purple. They do. So what is a neighbor, like you said, suddenly am I going to wake up next door and say to my neighbor, oh, I'm sorry, now we have to pick up guns and shoot one another? I think what we're going to continue to see is this kind of this low level violence that's happening throughout, unfortunately. But this idea of states actually seceding, I think that there are extreme pockets that say those things, but the state governments themselves, I don't see them taking that seriously, because they would be cutting off their noses to spite their faces. Like, how would that benefit them in any way? Okay, you're to form your own Republic of Oklahoma. How is that going to help you? And so you're going to be this little island surrounded by other states, and you're going to form what new trade agreements with them? And I mean, how is that? You're going to fight we're going to start fighting actual wars with what our National Guards fighting one another? I just cannot conceptualize how that could possibly work. But the low level violence that's already been having, like January 6th, I think that's going to continue to happen. Yeah, absolutely.
I think the idea that we can't say with certitude is just concerning in and of itself, right? Like we can't just laugh that question off, and that's a concern. But and to kind of be counter to your point, Merri, but the problem we're living in these days is you're absolutely right. Like I've talked to people I know from Texas, and they mention secession, and I think, okay, and all the federal money that's invested in Texas, like, do you guys think Fort Hood's going to be standing when you walk out of the Union, and all the jobs and all the money that pumps into the state is still going to be pumping into your economy? But they don't think that way. I mean, that is the problem. Like when you start getting into this sort of the ideology wars, it's not grounded in reality anymore. It's not looking at the economics of it. It's looking at we want what we perceive to be our rights, benefits, entitlement, whatever descriptor we want to use there. It goes away from reality, right, into this realm of ideals. And I think that's where it could really potentially become a thing. I don't know about, say Texas fighting Oklahoma or whatever, but trying to declare an independent state and put limits on who can come to Oklahoma or Texas, or what they're going to allow. There was the bill that just came up this week where they overrode the governor's veto. So and again, I could see. Yeah. And so I could see those sorts of things becoming like, fights against the federal government as well, as opposed to like a shooting civil war. I hope not. I agree with you to the extent that we're much more interconnected than we were in 1861. But I think the other things like economics, social justice, social issues, all of those could become real, which again becomes its own problem, right? Because you don't know where you stand when you leave, just for the sake of argument, right? When you drive out of Illinois and into Indiana. And I think that becomes its own problem. So.
To that, my quick thought on that question is, first, there's a reason I think I've had like 6 events in the past 9 months on topics like this, is that I share the panelists' concern of where we're at and the trajectory where it seems that we're headed. To Merri's point, I understand your point, but it's also internally within states, the rural-urban divide is so stark. And just the way that, you in my hometown in rural Nebraska is very different than where I was living in Chicago. And so you do see pretty big divisions based on where people live. And now people are making a lot of decisions about the businesses they support, the boycotts, the pressure put on businesses, people fleeing one state to another based on policies of not just tax policies, but others. Anyway, we're down to our final minute. Before I make my final comment, I just wanted to give the panelists a final opportunity, to make kind of a quick concluding remark if they have one, not to put you on the spot. But if there's anything you'd like to say before we conclude our event today.
Suck at concluding remarks. I hate doing. I like to think, maybe I'm Pollyanna-esque, but I am an optimist at heart, and I still do think that there are more things that unite us as Americans, that continue to unite us, that that maybe we don't see as much in the media, but that are still there, right? The neighbors that are around us, and the immigrants that surround us that we're friends with that we don't necessarily, again, those things that we don't focus on. I still am optimistic that we're going to be okay. I think this is just a really rough period that we have to move through. We've had rough periods in the past. I'm sure people said the same thing in the 60s, the 1960s. People said the same thing in the 1860s, and the Republic has endured. I got to admit, this last one was one where I was more worried about the Republic enduring than I have before. But look, so far we've made it through. So I'm going to continue to be optimistic.
I'm optimistic too. The first thing I'm thinking of as you're speaking, Merri, is the whole idea of, I'm an elder millennial, as sort of sitting here going, this isn't a joke. This can be fixed, but it's on us to fix it. And this is not a drill. We actually are the adults in the room, and it's on us to do the work to get it done. And we all have to kind of be able to work together and take it seriously and listen to those around us, because many of these issues that folks are dealing with, they're long-standing. They're not new. And so it's being, cognizant of that and appreciating it. That's a big deal.
Yeah, I'm an optimist as well. I'm not going to chirp in with the pessimist view, but I think, to build off your remark, Josh, I think we are at a time of reckoning where it's not just COVID. It's a lot of things that have been tamped down, swept under the carpet, ignored, and so forth for far too long, that are showing up as well, all at the same moment. And I think we finally, as a nation, do have to start to recognize and deal with them. But I think, yes, we can get through this. As long as we look at the person across the street or down the block, not as red versus blue or what have you, but as the neighbor who helped me out when I couldn't get my car out of the snowdrift, or as if we look for those things on a community level, then I think there is a great deal to be hopeful about.
Yeah. I would just agree with the three comments, and I think the optimism resides in us, and I'm including the panel members who volunteer their time for events like this, the dozens of people who take an hour and 15 minutes out of their day on a Friday to watch events like this, that this isn't destiny to go down some dark place with the Civil War, that we have agency in this, and to learn to collaborate, to work together and make this democracy stronger than we found it. And I just, I thanked our panel members at the beginning, but I just want to reiterate, history matters, and these faculty members are not only knowledgeable, they're very approachable, down to earth. I think I just would like to make a plug for their classes. There's often students who can, through
Plugs are always welcome.
Yes, get a college degree without having taken a history class is really scary. And if you are worried about any of the topics that we discussed, I think these three panel members just demonstrated how having an understanding of history can be really instructive to understanding current events, and just being a good, knowledgeable citizen. So take their classes. And thank you, panel members, for volunteering your time. And thank you those who took the time to watch our discussion today.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.